All right. Well, hello, everybody. This is Tim Rowley. I'm an instructor at CCBOOTCAMP, and today we're going to talk about a security topic, which is going to be SSL VPN specific to the ASA. And so let's go ahead and have a look here. Let's get started. So for the agenda today, like I said, we're going to be talking about ASA SSL VPN. And before we get into some of the nuts and bolts there, we're going to start out with some introduction into group policy and tunnel groups and see how those affect our SSL VPNs. Once we go through those brief intros, we'll start hitting the guts here. We'll talk about SSL VPN, Webvpn, and that clientless. Look at the operation, advanced features, and some troubleshooting there. Then we'll hop into the client version of that, the Anyconnect client, and we'll do the same demonstration there. And finally, we'll end with a live config demo. We'll get to see all these technologies work and some good tools to use to verify functionality and some things that are helpful not only for the real world but also for the lab exam. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So feel free in the GoToWebinar window pane there's a questions section. Go ahead and type in your questions as we go through the presentation, but I'm going to hold off on the answering until the end. But feel free to go ahead and type in your questions there anytime, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Okay, so our SSL VPNs are going to be based on group policies and tunnel groups, just like any other VPN, like our site-to-site VPN, remote access, easy VPN, things like that. ASAs like to use these group policies, and the group policies are basically a set of attributes which gets applied to a particular VPN session. Now, these attributes are applied after the tunnel is established, and so it's an example for a easy VPN type connection is after you connect and authenticate, you're going to be pushed down phase 1.5 settings like your DNS and DHCP settings, things like that. We also specify what type of VPN is this going to be. Is this going to be a site-to-site? Is this going to be a SVC for Anyconnect or Webvpn? So we specify the protocol that we're going to be expecting to use in this policy as well. So these attributes are applied, like I said, after the tunnel is established, but they can be held internally at the firewall or externally. So these group policies can be created on the firewall, or we can tell the firewall to reference an external system such as Radius or ACS to hold those policies, and then they'll be pushed down to the firewall after connection. So we have an option for internal or external here. Now we're talking about these attributes. Sometimes there's multiple spots to apply. We can apply them at the group policy, or we can apply them at the tunnel group, or we can even apply some at the user level. If we have local user accounts, we can specify some of these policies within that particular user. And so these attributes are applied by priority, and the more specific wins. So if we have a conflicting attribute that's applied at a group policy and a user, well, the user policy is going to win. So we can specify generic type policies, but then also we can override that with user-specific policies, and we'll take a look at that later on with the demo. So by default, there is a default group policy, which is shown there in the last bullet on the slide, and that's installed on configured on every firewall by default. And if you don't specifically call out a particular attribute within your group policy, then the setting that's held within the default group policy would apply. So if you're creating custom group policies to specify certain attributes for different connections, you don't have to worry about applying every single attribute. There's a lot of them in there. And the ones that you don't specifically care about tweaking, well, the default is just going to be applied based off the default group policy. So here we're talking about more specific wins again. So if you have a group policy that you've created, and there's an attribute in there that you've configured, but that also exists on the default group policy, your user-defined group policy is going to win. So the default group policy only gets applied in case you don't configure these attributes, and so it's kind of like a last attempt or last shot. Okay, so tunnel groups, which Cisco is more or less calling connection profiles these days, you'll see both, and it means the same thing. But tunnel groups is where we actually call out this group policy, and we say this particular tunnel group, when users are connecting to it or when a VPN is connecting to it, is going to reference all the attributes as specified within the group policy. So some of the things we configure within the tunnel group are address pools, like we have listed on the bullet here, AAA, for how are we going to authenticate these users into the tunnel. So going to be local authentication or authentication via ACS or TACACS or Radius. When we talk about the site-to-site VPN world, or even EasyVPN, we specify the pre-shared key in here. If we're doing a phase 1 pre-shared key authentication, we specify that in our tunnel group. And for the Webvpn and Anyconnect VPN world, group alias and group URL are some options that we'll actually look at in more detail later on. But these are all things that are important to the actual connection itself. These are options or attributes that are related to how is the person actually going to be connecting to the VPN here. Group policies are more after you connect, what is going to happen. Tunnel groups is what am I going to need to do in order to connect. And we have some defaults here as well. We have a default web group, default RA group, and a default LAN to LAN. So WebVPN group, of course, applies to WebVPN and Anyconnect. RA can apply to the EasyVPN connections, and L2L is for site-to-site. So the same rule applies here, that if you don't specify anything particularly specifically within your tunnel group, well, based on the type of tunnel group you've created, all the defaults will be inherited from the default groups. And so it's important to realize that these default groups are there. And the best way to see them is if you're in your firewall, you can do a show run all, and that'll give you all of the default configurations, including all these built-in groups, tunnel groups, and group policies. So let's remember that show run all. It's handy for not only the real world to see what options are available, but also for the lab exam. If you're trying to figure out what a default is for a certain parameter, then the show run all will give you that answer. Okay, so as I talked about a couple minutes ago, we also have the ability to set these attributes at the user level. So once you configure your user, another option will be available, and you can see there at the top of the slide the attributes. So first you create your user, and then you can give that particular user some specific attributes. And so some of them are listed in here. We have the VPN group policy, where we can apply a specific group policy to this user. We have a VPN tunnel protocol, where we can apply specific tunnel protocols that this particular user will be able to use. We can lock this user to a particular tunnel group so that they'll only be able to authenticate to a certain group. We have a service type, which is important, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. Service type will define if this user is able to administer the firewall or if they're only able to connect as a remote access user. So things like this are real handy to have in case you want to have more generic type of or more specific type of configuration applied to particular users and not have to create new groups. You can just create some specific attributes and apply it to the user itself. So with that, we'll go ahead and go into our first poll here. Let me throw it on the slide, and we'll have a look at some of the answers here. Let me pull up the first poll, and here we go. Give you about a minute or so to come up with that, and then we'll look at the answer. All right, so that was about a minute there. Let me go ahead and close the poll, and then we'll have a look at the results here. Okay, so we're talking about group policies, and if we have conflicting attributes or attributes that are applied at the group level and the user level, which one's going to win? So some of the answers in there could have been attractive, especially that last one, the user policy, but only if you enable the group user command. That command doesn't actually exist, and it's common to see questions like that you make you think, well, maybe that is a command that's out there, but for this particular question, we're looking for B there, the user policy, because it's more specific. So it's always going to be the rule of whichever attribute is applied more specifically will win. In this case, the user policy is about as specific as you can get, and so that's going to be the chosen attribute there. All right, let's go ahead and continue here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and have a talk at our first technology, Webvpn, or also called clientless SSL VPN. So what this is going to allow us to do is from any internet connected machine, as long as you have a browser of some kind and an internet connection, you can actually establish a secure tunnel with your firewall and access internal resources based on that secure tunnel. Now all this is done through the browser, so there's no clients or anything installed in the machine, which is why it's called clientless. It's all done based on browser connectivity, and so the applications that you can access through the SSL VPN are typically web-enabled applications. Okay? There's also some options for accessing internal email servers or file sharing servers through plugins. You can access systems, any TCP-based system through port forwarding or smart tunnel, and we'll talk about some of those today. But the main thing for WebVPN is that it's totally clientless. There's no software you need to install on that person's machine in order for them to get connectivity to the corporate network. So the thing to think about from the firewall's perspective, what is it doing on behalf of the user here? The user has a SSL connection established to the firewall, but then what's happening at that point? Is the user actually connected to the corporate network, or are they routable on the network at that point? Well, with the WebVPN clientless connection, the answer is no, that the user is not actually connected or routable to the corporate network at that point. What's happening is that the firewall is proxying all their requests of access to the end result, to the end destination. So if you're connected via SSL VPN and you want to access an internally hosted web server, you're going to browse to that URL through the portal on your machine, but the firewall is actually going to take that connection, establish the connection to the backend server on behalf of the client, and then rejoin that through the SSL tunnel. So your machine, the user's machine, isn't actually connecting to the resources. It's just connecting to the firewall, and the firewall is proxying that, acting as a proxy in the middle. So some of the things to consider there is as far as SSL certificates. If you're connecting to something on the corporate network that uses a certificate, the user's browser isn't actually doing the certificate verification, because all that's done between the proxying of the firewall and the web server. So the firewall is the device that's doing the certificate verification, and the client isn't actually getting involved with that process. They're just talking pretty much to the firewall at this point. So it's important to understand that the firewall may be validating the certificate, but your user's computer isn't. And some things to think about there as well. What if the certificate's not valid, or what if the certificate, if I'm not trusting particular certificate authorities? Well, the firewall doesn't do any certificate authority trusting. It's just going to look at the certificate validity date range pretty much, and as long as it's valid, it's going to accept it. So if it's a certificate that's out of its validity date range, then it's going to fail. So things to keep in mind there, that you typically, if you were dealing with a certificate that was expired, you might get that nice little Windows screen that allows you to connect anyway. With the firewall, with WebVPN, it's going to drop that by default. So we always want to be careful and realize that. So since all this is happening between the user's browser and the firewall, we want to make sure that we're supporting common SSL or TLS versions. So if we're dealing with a browser that we're only allowing like SSL or TLS version 1 or 2 or SSL version 3 or whatever have you, we just want to make sure that it's a version of that SSL or TLS that it's going to allow us to use all the technologies we want. And we'll see an example of that when we talk about port forwarding. That with port forwarding, you have to use a certain type of negotiated TLS in order for that to actually work. So let's go ahead and move on to the advanced options here. So as with any other technology, there's always the basic stuff just to make it work, just to get it on the network. But we also have some advanced features here with WebVPN. And typically, as with any other advanced feature, it's about making the user experience better, making it seem more of a technology that's attractive and something that they'd want to use. So with WebVPN, we have the options called application access, and this is applied via port forwarding and smart tunnels. So with port forwarding, we'll talk about that one first. Port forwarding allows you to access TCP-based applications directly over the SSL VPN. Now you're still being proxied. You're still being proxied at the firewall, but the advantage here is that now you can use applications that aren't necessarily web-based. So, for example, we can maybe Telnet or SSH. If we're using our SSL VPN against the firewall, but we want to be able to manage routers inside the corporate network, we can use port forwarding to do that. And what happens is, as soon as you enable application access through port forwarding, after you authenticate and establish your VPN, the firewall will actually install a Java applet on the user's machine. And what that applet is going to do is open up local ports on that machine itself. So, for example, you can configure the firewall to say, after you authenticate, then port 2055. If you were to send traffic locally to that port, that's going to be sent over the firewall, over the VPN to the firewall, and then proxied to the real destination. So once you authenticate, you'll either be automatically asked to install this applet, or you can optionally have it be done on demand by clicking the application access button. And we'll get to see this in action today. But the thing about port forwarding is that for every single device that you want to remotely connect to across the VPN, you need to have a unique port forward statement configured for that. So if you're configuring, if you want to have a lot of different access over this through port forwarding, then you can start to get into a configuration nightmare with thousands of port forwarding statements. Also, it requires some special user instruction. Now, rather than just launching their email client or telnet client, now they need to know to configure their client in such a way that it will direct traffic to this dynamically created local port, which will then be hijacked by the Java applet and sent over the VPN. So it's a little more of a burden on instruction to allow users to take advantage of the port forwarding. It also requires administrative privileges, so you need to have that type of privilege on the machine in order to launch to accept that Java applet. So this is why sometimes when you're dealing with port forwarding, this Java applet is referred to as a thin client. So clientless Webvpn is what we've been talking about. Now when we add this Java applet, it's called a thin client. There's no applications that are actually installed. It's just this Java applet that's launched, and it's only there for the life of the tunnel, but it's still called a thin client at this point. So to take that a step further now, there's the feature called Smart Tunnel, which effectively replaces port forwarding in some cases. But the main advantage to Smart Tunnel is that rather than specifying a ton of different port forward statements, we can say anytime this particular path is launched on the user's machine, like in the last slide here, anytime telnet.exe is launched, that traffic is going to be hijacked and sent over the tunnel. So now instead of, like I said, say if we had 50 routers we wanted to manage through our Webvpn, we'd have to have 50 port forward statements. So now instead of doing that, we can configure a smart tunnel. Anytime we launch this particular application, telnet.exe, that traffic is going to be hijacked and sent over the tunnel. So it makes it a little easier for more of a broad type of access. It doesn't require any administrator privileges, and it's more efficient. Now we don't have to have any type of special user instruction to say, well, when you're working from a hotel or from home and you're using your clientless VPN, you need to make sure you connect on these ports, but when you're in the office, connect using these ports, and that's just too confusing for people who are just trying to work remotely. So this allows us to push these policies, and anytime they launch a connection against a particular application, that traffic will be sent over the tunnel. Now, traffic is still being proxied here. Nothing is talking directly to the end machine, the end destination. It's still being proxied through the firewall, but it's just being proxied in a way now that applications as a whole are being sent over the tunnel. So let's kind of put this together now and look at the configuration. How is this configured? So with Webvpn, we need to first go into the global Webvpn mode and configure the interface which we expect to terminate connections on. So in this case, in config T, we do our Webvpn command, and then we do our enable interface command. Which actual interface is going to be terminating these tunnels, inside, outside, whatever interface name you've used. Okay, if we're doing port forwarding now, we configure the actual port forward within Webvpn config mode. Again, this is global Webvpn mode. As we see down here, there's another WebVPN within group policy, but right now we're just doing WebVPN at the global level. Okay, so we define our port forward, give it a unique name, and then we say on the machine that's connecting, what is the local host port that the Java applet is going to open up? So we can specify any port number here. Typically we want to use a non-well-known port, though, to something that's, just some funky port, whatever. And then when that traffic is hijacked and sent over the tunnel, what am I going to translate that to? The real destination and the real destination port. So if you're a user and we wanted to telnet to a router, we'd say, localhost port 2050 or 20,050 maybe. When that traffic is seen on port 20,050, the firewall is going to translate it maybe to the real IP address of the router and then port 23. So we specify that almost like a static statement in here, like a static pat here, or a port-based static, where we're specifying a before and after. It's the same kind of idea here, just it's done through port forwarding and WebVPN. Okay, now when a user connects to the portal page, when you browse in your browser to https:// then the IP address of the firewall, you're going to be presented with a login screen. And if you have multiple tunnel groups configured, you can see a drop-down that has all the various tunnel groups available to you. That drop-down doesn't appear until we do this tunnel group list enable command. So the tunnel group list enable command will allow the drop-down to appear, and now the user can select which particular tunnel group they want to connect to, whether they want to connect maybe to an admin tunnel group or to a remote user or to a sales group, what have you. It's different in every environment, but tunnel group list enable is what's going to do that for us, allow that drop-down to appear. Okay, so by default, the firewall is going to do local authentication. So if we want to stick with that and do local authentication, then we specify a username and password. Otherwise, we can configure it to reference an external system such as a Radius through ACS. In this example here, we're doing local, so we configure a username and password on the firewall itself. And we'll talk about this when we get into our config demo, but these web type access lists is something that's unique to SSL VPN. When you want to filter traffic through your site-to-site IPsec VPN, you can use a special access list that's bound to a VPN filter command through a group policy. VPN filters aren't an option with Webvpn, so we have to configure a special web type access list, which is shown here with this special keyword web type. That's going to allow us to filter traffic within the tunnel. So maybe you'll be able to connect to the service, to the SSL VPN, and get a connection established, but we only want to allow certain access maybe, so we can do that through an access list here. And we'll look at some examples of this, but the permit URL is interesting because you can actually put the particular URL path in this command line here. So permit URL http cisco.com maybe, or whatever website you want. Okay. So now we configure our group policies here. Again, these are attributes that are applied to the tunnel. So the first thing we need to do is configure our group policy, give it a name, and specify, is it internal or external? Are these attributes going to be held locally on the firewall, or are we going to house these attributes on an external system? As soon as you do this command, you're not going to be put into group policy mode. You're going to be put into right back into config mode, and now you can issue the attributes command to start putting your attributes in. So sometimes it's easy to do the first command, the group policy name, and then internal, and then start plugging in your attributes, but you're going to get a bunch of errors because you're not in that mode yet. So remember, you're just defining it, and then the second thing, you go in and give the attributes. Now you're in attribute mode, and you configure everything that's related to your task. In this case, we're doing Webvpn as our tunnel protocol. And now we can get into more Webvpn type configuration here. Now, notice that, like I talked about in the very first Webvpn there, it's the same command, Webvpn, but when you do it in the group policy, you're going to be put into Webvpn group policy. Whereas if you did it in the beginning here in config mode, you're just put into global Webvpn mode. The configuration options are totally different in there, but sometimes it's easy to get confused with the two spots of where Webvpn is configured. Just remember there's one globally and one that's applied per group policy, and they have different configuration attributes in there. Okay, so within WebVPN group policy mode, this is where we call out things like our filter access list. We call out things like our port forward name. So these are options these are things that have been configured earlier, and now we're actually putting them into play by applying them in their WebVPN group policy configuration mode. Just by configuring the port forward within the WebVPN global config mode doesn't actually apply it anywhere. Same thing with the access list. Just by configuring an access list doesn't mean it's actually going to do anything. We need to apply it. And these are applied through through group policy WebVPN mode. Now the last line here, port forward, auto start, or enable, means that after authentication, that port forward application access will automatically start and the user will be presented with a Java applet, or it's going to be manual. So if we want it to be manual, then we'll just say enable, call out the name, and then when the user authenticates and connects, there's going to be a gray button that says application access. They click that and it starts it up manually. So just based on the task requirements or based on what you're trying to do in your production world, it's a couple different options there. But just like anything else with these all these advanced options, we want to make sure that, especially for the lab exam, that we're configuring it per the task. It's really important to remember that just because something is working doesn't mean you're going to get full points for that. In fact, remember, it's all or nothing. There's no partial credit for these questions. So if you go through all this time configuring your WebVPN and it's working, and you just move on, that's great that it's working. That's part one. But part two is the direction following. So if it said that the port forward application access should be manually enabled, but you configured it for auto start, even though everything's working, you're not going to get any points for that task. You just want to be really careful when you're reading these tasks, because sometimes there's a lot of bullets in here, a lot of things to configure. If any one of those is misconfigured, then you're not going to get points. So it's just something to consider there. All right, so the second half of our configuration now, the tunnel group. So we want to configure our tunnel group. In this case, it's going to be a type remote access. So we're going to say, this is a remote access. The other option in there is site to site, but this is a remote access VPN, so we do that. And the same thing is true with the group policy, that we're just first defining our group policy. Oops. Hold on a second, I lost my screen there. First thing we're going to do is configure our tunnel group, okay, and we're giving it a type, just like with our group policy. We said it was internal, and now we're put back in the global mode, and now we can do our attributes. So first you're telling the firewall about it, and then you're saying, okay, now that you know about it, here's what I want to configure within that. So you create it, then you go into attributes mode. Within general attributes, we're going to call out our group policy. So whatever group policy we just configured, we call out that name. Okay, so that's really all we're going to do in general attributes here. Within our WebVPN attributes, we have some customization here. So we have a group alias command and a group URL command here. These aren't required, but what it's going to allow you to do is to customize these names to maybe something that you've got on your firewall that's not really user-friendly, but create a name that is user-friendly so that when a user connects to the portal page, they'll see a group name that would make sense to them. So in this example, maybe we have tunnel group name group 1 or high security, something like that. That's good for us, maybe, the people who are administering the firewall and trying to keep things organized, but when the user connects and sees a drop-down with group 1 or high security in it, they're not going to know necessarily what that means unless you've told them which one to connect to. So with the group alias command, we can say that we're going to say when the user sees this in the drop-down, it's going to appear as the custom name, and that custom name is an alias of the tunnel group name. So we can say the group alias would be sales or remote or admin or something like that, something that's easier for the user to know what they want. We can also specify a custom path within the URL itself. So we can say that normally you'd connect to the HTTPS and the IP address of the firewall, but we can also add a / and a custom path here. So maybe / sales or / remote team, something like that. And when the user puts that custom path into their browser, they're not going to see the drop-down. They're going to be directed straight into this tunnel group, which is referencing the group URL. So there's some customization there. not only important for the real world, but real important for the lab exam to make sure we're configuring things exactly as the task is requiring. One other important thing to note here about this custom path is that it's case sensitive, and we'll see an example of that today, where if you have all uppercase here, but on your browser you type in lowercase in that custom path, it's not going to work. So it's case sensitive on this path statement. So just because we're doing local authentication here, we want to be careful, because if we're also doing local authentication for administrative sessions into the firewall itself, every single account that we've just configured for Webvpn access would also have the ability to configure the firewall itself if we're doing local authentication. So we have the ability within user attributes to specify a service type. And what this is going to mean is if we do a service type remote access, this particular user is only going to be able to access the firewall from a remote access perspective. They're not going to be able to manage the firewall in any way. So important to realize this service type is there. And the group locks, meaning that there may be 30 tunnel groups on this particular firewall, but this user is only going to be able to authenticate into this one particular group. So you can group lock users into particular groups, limiting their access to the various groups that may be available to them. You don't want maybe maybe a sales team or an engineering team to be able to authenticate into each other's tunnel groups, because they might have different levels of access. And so it's just a way to segregate if you need that type of segregation in your remote access solution. All right, so I'm going to throw out the second poll here before we get into Anyconnect. So let me go ahead and throw that out, and we'll have a look. Okay, so that was about a minute there. Let me go ahead and close the poll and have a look at the answer here. Okay, so when Webvpn is enabled on the ASA, does DTLS get enabled by default? So we have some options here. Yes, and it uses TCP 443. Yes, but you have to designate a port. No, or yes, and it uses UDP 443. So the correct answer here is D, yes, and it uses UDP port 443. So DTLS is datagram transport layer security, and when you first do your WebVPN config from global mode, you'll see a pop-up that says DTLS and TLS have been configured. So it actually listens for both at any given time. The main, we'll talk about this a little bit more with Anyconnect, but the main advantage to DTLS is that it's UDP in that it aids its performance. So if there's latency sensitive applications like voice or video, DTLS is actually used by default with Anyconnect, and it can fail over to a TLS TCP port 443 if there's a problem with a UDP 443 DTLS session. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming slides, but yes, it is enabled, and it uses UDP 443 by default. All right. So let's go ahead and move into Anyconnect VPN here. Now, a lot of the things that we just talked about applies directly to Anyconnect. All the tunnel groups, the group policies, the Webvpn configuration, it's all the same thing here, except with Anyconnect, we're introducing a new client. So a client is actually installed on the user's machine for Anyconnect. It starts out just like a typical clientless WebVPN session, where any machine that's connected to the internet and has a browser can browse to the firewall. After authentication, a client would be pushed down to that machine, that connecting machine, and would be installed automatically. And after the installation, it'll reconnect with the client itself. So it's kind of a two-step process there. First, we're just authenticating to the WebVPN service. We're telling the firewall that we're authenticating into a tunnel group that references the Anyconnect client. That client gets pushed down and installed, and then it reconnects using the client. And then from that point on, the user is on the network. So the big difference here is that not only is it client-based, but once you connect, you're getting some attributes similar to EasyVPN's Phase 1.5, where a user is getting an IP address that's routable on the corporate network. They're getting DNS settings, maybe they're getting WIN settings. So at this point, the firewall isn't doing the proxying between the user's machine and the corporate resource, because now there's a client that's involved, and it's given an IP address that's routable, and the user directly connects to these end services without being proxied through the firewall. So the client can be auto-downloaded, or the user can be prompted for that. So after you authenticate to your particular tunnel group, the user can be prompted with the svc ask command saying, do you want to install this application or not, this client or not. Default is to be auto-downloaded, but you can specify that we want to ask the user first. The client remains installed by default after the disconnect. Now I put a star there, and the reason why I did that because there's conflicting information within the documentation. If you look at the config guide for 8.0, it says that the client is uninstalled after the session is disconnected. If you look at the command lookup tool, it says that the client remains installed. So what I did recently, I did a show run all on the firewall in my rack here, and it says that the svc keep installed is configured to remain. So maybe it's dependent on the version of firewall ASA you're running, but if you're questioning which one if you're taking the lab exam, if you're questioning that, remember you can do your show run all, and you'll see all the options there in their default state, and you can see which one your firewall is configured for. Mine happened to be configured to use to keep the installer installed after disconnect. So we talked a little bit about DTLS. With Anyconnect, as soon as you establish the Anyconnect connection, there's going to be two different tunnels created, one with DTLS, one with SSL or TLS. And you'll actually see that in the firewall. We'll have a look at that today when we get into the demo. You'll see the two different connections there, and it'll favor the UDP-based DTLS connection first. You can configure it to fail over, so if there's some kind of problem with your DTLS connection, the firewall is going to be doing some dead peer detection between the client and the gateway. In this case, the gateway is the firewall. So the client can pull the firewall, and the firewall can pull the client. If there's any problem, then it'll fail over to just straight TLS. So it'll fall over or fail over to that. So we'll actually get to see some hit count increase, and we'll see bytes being transferred, and we'll notice that it prefers the DTLS connection first because it's a performance gain based on UDP. And if there's a problem with that, it'll fail over to TLS. If your client or connected device is behind something that does translation of some kind, which is going to be pretty much all the time, you're rarely going to be given a public IP address these days. So you'll be given an IP address from the site's internal network, and then when you actually perform your VPN, that's going to be translated at that site's edge into a public IP that's routable on the internet. The importance of this keep alive is that now you're kind of at the mercy of that translation table being current at the device that's translating you. If that goes away, then your VPN is going to go down. Maybe there's some kind of idle timeout or some kind of timer on that translation table. These keep alives are sent from the client towards the firewall and says every so many seconds I'm going to send a keep alive packet, and that'll keep my translation table current, and hopefully would keep my translation table, the translation table current enough or long enough for me to keep my connection established as long as I need it to. So keep alives are important for NAT-T, or that NAT traversal. And optionally, we can adjust the MTU. So if we're worried about overhead with all the headers being added on, the IP, UDP, DTLS headers, we can adjust the MTU to avoid fragmentation. So let's have a look at some of this here in the Anyconnect config. So just like with our clientless Webvpn configuration, we had to go into Webvpn global mode and configure some options here. Remember, we're just going to enable this on the interface that we're expecting connections to terminate. Now, if you already have this configured, maybe you have an environment where you're doing Anyconnect VPN and clientless. You don't have to obviously enable it twice. Just remember that it's specific to the interface that's terminating. So if you have two interfaces in the firewall that are both terminating this, you want to make sure that both interfaces have this configured. Otherwise, you can terminate both on the same single interface and only have to do this enable command once. The difference now with Anyconnect is we need to do some SVC settings, which is SSL VPN client. First, we need to enable it, saying that this Webvpn configuration on this firewall is going to support SVC. And then we tell the firewall when I want to push the client down to a particular connecting device, where does that image exist on myself? So you can do a DIR in the firewall, and you can say, okay, the path where this is locally installed on the firewall is in disk 0, and you just specify that path with the SVC image command. Now the firewall will know where am I going to find this package to push down to clients. And you can have multiple images in here. If you're doing Windows or Mac or whatever, you can have multiple images in here, and you assign an identifier, a unique number to each one, and the firewall will just attempt each one in that list until it finds one that works. Now, since we're doing IP address assignment here with this full client-based VPN, we specify a local pool so that once users are connected and they're getting their more or less phase 1.5 information, they're going to give them an IP address that's routable on the network. This can be done locally, as we're doing here, or you can also specify a remote DHCP server where the firewall will act as a relay and pull an IP address from a DHCP server. Now again, since we're doing a client-based VPN, we can also do split tunneling. So after connection, maybe we only care about certain traffic being sent over the tunnel. Everything else would be able to go out the user's local default gateway. So anything that we specify in this access list is going to be sent over the tunnel. So we're calling out destination IPs here. What IP addresses on the corporate side of the network do we care about encrypting or including in the tunnel? So anything else is going to match the deny any that's implicit after every access list and be sent out the local default gateway and it won't be sent across the tunnel. Okay, so now we specify our group policy, internal or external, and then we specify attributes. So in this case, the tunnel protocol is going to be SVC, and then we can call out our split tunnel access list. It's tunnel specified, and the value is going to be the name of the access list that we just configured above. And then we call out our address pool. So we can also reference the address pool in the tunnel group, but group policies can be applied to multiple tunnel groups. So we can specify this address pool within the group policy or within the tunnel group. Now finally we get into our Webvpn configuration here. Again, this is Webvpn that's within within group policy, and these options are totally different than what we just saw above with the global Webvpn configuration. And all these are optional here. These are just the things that we talked about in the last slide. So SVC ask is going to ask the user if they want to install the client or not. Keep installer none means that after the client disconnects, the installer will be uninstalled, the client will be uninstalled. DPD for dead peer detection. After how many seconds is the gateway going to pull the client? How many seconds is the client going to pull the gateway? Remember, the gateway is the firewall. The keep alive for NAT traversal. Every 60 seconds, the client will send a keep alive to the firewall to keep that local translation table built. And then we can tweak the MTU as well here. And all this is applied per group policy. So you can have multiple group policies applied to different tunnel groups, and that will then give you the customization so you can configure any policy you want based on what type of users you're expecting to connect. So our tunnel group is still going to be remote access. That hasn't changed. There's nothing special to do there. Just like with Webvpn, we're going to call out our group policy within our tunnel group general attributes. And then if we want to, we can specify aliases with Anyconnect as well. And that's always done within Webvpn attributes. And just like with clientless, we have our username commands with user attributes if we want to apply group lock or service types as well. So a lot of these options are the same as what we saw with clientless. Just the big things to remember are those SVC commands. But the same flow is there. You're always going to configure global WebVPN mode. You're always going to configure a group policy, and then you're always going to reference that group policy in a tunnel group. And if you want to have customization with the group URL or alias, you can do that within tunnel group WebVPN configuration. So just learning that this is the new kind of a common theme with any VPN is important, not just with WebVPN or SSL VPN, but also with site-to-site VPN, Easy VPN. They're all going to use this group and tunnel group policy type of configuration. So some commands we'll actually look at when we get to the demo here in a second. These some verification commands that are good. The show VPN session DB will allow you to see the currently connected VPNs. So what WebVPNs or what SVC Anyconnect VPNs are connected at this point, and it'll give you some interesting information in there. We'll look at when we test in a minute. Show con all is important to see the connections that are not only traveling through the firewall, but also to and from the firewall. So when we're talking about clientless WebVPN, where the firewall is proxying all these connections for us, if we do a show con, we're not going to see anything. We have to do a show con all, and that will allow us to see the connections that are being proxied. And we'll get to see that as well today. Show log and show access list are always important just to see hit count and anything that's happening in the logs there. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to throw out my last poll here, and while we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and boot up the rack here, and we'll have a look at the configuration and see this stuff in action. So let's go ahead and throw out the last poll, and I'll get that ready to go. Okay, so true or false, there's a special ASA command that will allow you to see general config steps for VPN technologies. Now this is actually true. There's a command you can do within config mode called VPN setup, and we'll look at that in a second here. You do a VPN setup, specify what type of VPN you're trying to configure, issue the steps command, and then it'll give you a general idea of what to configure. It's not a script of any kind. It doesn't actually configure anything for you, but it gives you the general framework of what's required to configure particular types of VPN. So we'll have a look at that here when I hop into the rack. All right, so let me go ahead and get in there. Okay, so before we get into the demo here, let me go ahead and show that VPN command. So you got to go into config T, VPN setup, and then look at the options we have in here. We have IPsec remote access, L2TP site-to-site, and SSL remote access. So we do VPN setup, SSL steps, You see it gives you like steps 1 through so many here on what you should look for your configuration, not only from the VPN perspective, but also from the basic stuff, your interfaces, your routes, things like that you're also going to need for a VPN to work. So it's just kind of handy just for double checking yourself. So let's say we look at the VPN setup, site-to-site, steps. Same thing here with site-to-site VPN, phase 1, phase 2, access list, all good stuff in here just for easy reference. Okay, so I have a little cheat sheet here just to save time with typing, but we'll talk about each of these commands before I plug it into the firewall. But what we're going to do is let me first show the picture. Okay, so we have a pretty basic network here. We have the firewall in the middle, and this is again, just for demonstration purposes to see the technology. But what we're going to do first is from the ACS server, we're going to create a clientless SSL VPN, Webvpn to the firewall's inside interface, and we're going to do some port forwarding. So after that connection is established, the ACS server should be able to administer R2. So we should be able to telnet to R2 and get a prompt there. Then we'll go into Anyconnect. Using the test PC in VLAN 2, we'll connect to the outside interface of the firewall, launch the client, install the client, and then at that point we should be able to ping R1 or telnet to R1, and we shouldn't be proxied at the firewall. And we'll look at some show commands as we go through this. So let's start with the Webvpn here, clientless. Okay, so since this is the inside, we're going to enable on the inside interface. And for our port forward, we're going to name it R2 just because that's related to what we're trying to do. The local port is going to be 2023, and the destination IP in port is going to be 23. Okay, so we're going to connect to R2 22.12.2, and it's going to hit port 23 on that service. Okay, tunnel groupless enable, again, that's going to allow us to see a drop-down of all the tunnel groups that are available. We're only going to have one at this point, so it's not going to show anything other than that one, but when we get into Anyconnect, we'll have 2 groups, and we'll see the drop-down difference there. We have a local username named Webvpn, password Cisco, and then our web type access list. Here we're going to say that this particular user will be able to authenticate and connect with a clientless VPN, SSL VPN, but we're only going to allow telnet to our port forward destination, and we're only going to allow HTTP to R2's web service. So it's just showing an example of limiting what type of access the particular user has here. Okay, so then we create our group policy. Again, we're just creating it here, and then we give it our attributes. It's going to be a type Webvpn, and we're going to call out our filter and our port forward statement. In this case, it's an auto start. So as soon as we establish that connection, it should launch the application access, and we'll be able to start administering R2 via the SSL port forward. Okay, now we create our tunnel group. We're going to name it Group 1. It's remote access type. Configure our general attributes, which is where we always call out our group policy, which is called Webvpn. And we're going to create some Webvpn attributes for some customization. So the group alias for Group 1 is going to be admin, all capital. So when we connect and see the drop-down, we shouldn't see Group 1, we should see admin in the drop-down. And we can alternately connect to this path here, /admin, and that will direct us directly to this tunnel group without having to select anything from a drop-down. Now, since we're also doing local authentication for administering the firewall, we're going to do a service type remote access so that this particular username Webvpn won't be able to administer the firewall. They're only going to be able to access the firewall from a remote access standpoint. And we're going to lock this user to Group 1. So in our next example, when we configure Anyconnect, this user shouldn't be able to authenticate into the Anyconnect group. It's locked to this group only. And as with any firewall, you should always turn on logging, which is just to give yourself more eyes into troubleshooting and watching things happen there. So let me go ahead and copy this, and I'll plug it in. Okay. Now notice as soon as I did this, here's the informational message saying Webvpn and DTLS are enabled on inside. So it's already ready to go for both there. And we'll see a better example of that in Anyconnect where it uses both by default. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop into the ACS server here. Open up a browser. Okay. 192.168.2.10. And we should get the security alert for the certificate not being good, and that's fine. And so here's our portal page. We have our drop-down list with nothing in it right now, just the one group. That's all we have configured, so that's fine. And notice it's the admin, so it's used the customization there. It's not using group 1. Okay. Now we also configured the group URL. So if we do a /admin, same thing appears. Oop, let me. There it goes. So notice the drop-down is now gone because we've specified a particular path in that URL that's calling out a tunnel group, and so we don't have to specify anything. We don't have to choose anything from a drop-down here. So now notice if I do a /admin, but not capital. See, it's case sensitive, remember, so that's not going to work. It has to be whatever you've used in your group URL has to match the same case that you're actually using from the browser. Otherwise, you're going to get this error. Okay. So let's go ahead and authenticate and see the application access work here. Okay, so Webvpn, Cisco. So here's the portal page now, and to the left, this is the application access kicking off here. So we have to trust. We get a pop-up to trust the content, the Java. Click yes on that, and then we present it with our application access here, and it even gives you some configuration that can tell you what is available to you. So we have a name R2. Locally, if we send any traffic to port 20,023, it should end up at the remote IP 22.122 port 23. So let's go ahead and launch a command prompt, and we'll telnet to localhost 127.0.0.1 port 20,023, and there we are. Now we're at R2 through the VPN. Okay, so we didn't actually talk to the R2 address itself. We talked to the local host. You were telnetting to our local IP address here, and we've ended up at R2. So now with the firewall, let's have a look at some show commands to see how that's playing out. So show VPN session Webvpn. Here's the connecting user. Username Webvpn. It's a clientless port forward, which we have configured. Okay, using RC4 encryption. The group policy that's applied is called Webvpn. Okay, the tunnel group is called group 1. So we can verify that, yes, it's working, but is it working per the task still? So this is the place to check yourself. Am I connecting to the group I want to be connecting to? Is it using the appropriate type of connection? Is the username correct in the syntax? So it's a way to check yourself again here. So now if we do our show con, notice there's nothing in there. We don't see show con doesn't tell us anything about traffic destined to or from the firewall, only traffic through the firewall. And since we're proxying everything here, we need to do a show con all, and now we'll see the different stuff in here. We have first the SSL VPN itself, that's established, and then at the last line here, here's the actual port forward. There's the connection that says from the firewall, which is 22.1.2.10, I'm connecting on behalf of the user to R2 port 23. Then we see some bytes being transferred there. Okay, so that's the way to verify that your port forwarding and everything is working. Is show con doesn't tell you about this. You have to do show con all in order to see traffic that's destined to or from the firewall. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and close this down, and then we'll look at the Anyconnect. Log out. Close that. And let me get into. Now, if you try to do an Anyconnect connection through RDP, you get an error message saying that it's not supported within RDP. So you have to VNC into a device in order to test Anyconnect. So just keep that in mind when you're testing yourselves. So let's look at the configuration here first, and we'll plug it in. So Anyconnect. Now, same thing here, what we talked about, we have to enable Webvpn. In this case, since we're expecting any connections to terminate on the outside interface, we want to specify outside, so we're enabling it on the outside. And then we want to call out the two SVC commands, one to enable it and one, where does this exist on the firewall? So if you look at the firewall, do a dir, here it is right here, here's our package. So disk 0, and then the name of this Anyconnect path is what we're going to specify, which is what we have here in our config script. We create our pool. What IP are we going to assign to this connecting user? In this case, we're going to assign them something between 22.1, 100, 100, and 150. And the important thing here is that that subnet needs to be routable. So if you expect the reply traffic to get back from the ultimate destination, that destination needs to know when I want to reply to this connecting address, where am I going to route that to? So maybe you're doing reverse route injection, or you just have some static routes configured, but you need to make sure that your pool is routable and that the reply traffic knows where to go. We can specify a split tunnel access list. Again, it's a standard access list that defines destinations. What destinations do we care about requiring encryption through the tunnel? Anything that's not specified here is going to match the deny any and be sent out the user's local default gateway. Okay, so we're going to create a new group policy, call it Anycon. Okay, it's internal, and then we give it attributes. SVC is the protocol. Call out our split tunnel access list, and then we call out our address pool. So address pool value any pool. We'll go ahead and create a tunnel group called group 2, since group 1 was already in use. It's still a type remote access that encompasses, you know, a lot of things there. SSL, clientless, Anyconnect, easy VPN, all these are encompassed by group remote access type. Then we give ourselves some general attributes. As always, we're going to call out our group policy, and then we configure our Webvpn attributes. In this case, we're just going to give an alias of remote. So now in the drop-down, we should see admin and remote, because that's the two aliases that we've configured. We're not doing any URL customization here. We're just going to stick with the normal IP address for the URL. Now again, since default authentication is local, we're going to stick with that, create a local account, lock this account to group 2, and it's a remote access type as well. So now we can actually do some testing with this group lock. We'll launch the browser to associate with group 2, but what the Webvpn user shouldn't be able to authenticate to that, but the Anycon should. So let's go ahead and paste this in and give it a shot. Now notice again, when we enabled it on the outside interface, Webvpn, we got the same informational error, informational message that Webvpn and DTLS are both enabled. Okay, so now if we hop into our ACS here, before we get into that, let's have a look at the group lock. So from this machine, we do our HTTPS 168.2.10. Now, since we're accessing the inside interface and we're referencing the admin group, we should not be able to authenticate with the Anycon user account because he's locked to group 2. So if we try Anycon with admin, it should fail, which is what we want to see. So that user is locked to one group and can't authenticate to the admin group. So now if we go to our VNC here and do the same thing, now we're connected to the outside interface of the firewall, so we want to reference the outside IP address in our browser. So have the same portal page, the same options are available to us here. If we go to the remote group and try to log in as Webvpn, it should fail. Okay, which it does. He's locked to group 1. So let's go ahead and try the real one here, Anycon, Cisco, and the remote group. Now this should pop up with a VPN client installation, ask us to accept the unknown certificate, which is fine. And now it's going to install the client And after it installs it, it's going to launch the client and connect to the VPN all in one go here. So as the user, we don't have to do this. We don't have to do this twice because it's kind of happening twice here. First, we access the firewall to get the client, and then it's going to access the firewall again with the client. But since we've already specified the group and what the group name we want to connect to, the VPN client is going to remember that and go ahead and establish that connection for us. So now it's already done. We can go ahead and close our browser and double-click on our VPN client. So here it says we're connected. We were given an IP address of 100, which is what we'd expect from our pool. The server we're connecting to, or the firewall, the gateway, is .10, which is good. Okay. So just some click on details real quick, see if we get anything else. We are doing split tunneling. And here's some traffic being sent and received using AES 128, DTLS for our protocol, which is the default. Okay. So let's go ahead and have a look at some testing here. Let's close this. So now that we have an IP address that's routable on the network, we should go ahead and, or should be able to just ping something on the other side without having to be proxied through the firewall. So we'll ping R1 2.1, and there's our reply. So now again, since we're not being proxied, this traffic should show up as a normal show con. So if we just telnet to R1. Now if we do a show con, we should see this in there. And there it is. There's our port 23 connection between our unique IP address, which is assigned to us through the VPN, and the ultimate destination here, port 23. Now if we do our show con all, we'll see the DTLS and the TLS connections is here. So here's the UDP. On the very far left it says UDP here. That's how you know that that's the DTLS one, port 443, and that's where all the bytes are being transferred here. Now the TCP side, the standard TLS connection right at the very bottom is also there, and there's just more or less control traffic being sent across that, which is why there are some bytes incrementing there. But the majority of the traffic, the user traffic, is going to be going over that DTLS tunnel until it goes down. Now, if you didn't configure your dead peer detection, it's not going to auto-fail over to the TLS connection. So you need to configure the dead peer detection if you want that failover to occur. Okay, so let's do another show command, our show VPN session SVC. And here's the same stuff we saw as before, but now this is related to our Anyconnect connection, so our username Anycon, the IP address that we were assigned. This is a DTLS tunnel. It starts out clientless, but we're using the client now. SSL VPN, RC4 encryption, AES 128, the group policy, the tunnel group, all things that are good to verify that you're connecting per the task. Because it's really easy to get excited when something works in the lab, and then later you fail and wonder how could you have failed when everything was working. Well, two parts to the exam. Remember, part one, is it working? Part two, is it working per the task? And it's real easy to lose points by overlooking something, and that's why it's real important to do as much verification as you can to verify that yes, it's working and it's working per the task. All right, so we're still connected here, and everything's happy with our Anyconnect. Okay, let me bring the slides back up here. So that was the end of the config demo here. Before we go into the Q&A, gonna turn it over to Jerry real quick here. He's part of our sales team, and he has a couple quick things to say there for us. So Jerry, if you're on the line, it's unmuted for you.
Great, thanks, Tim. Just wanted to make a couple announcements here for those of you who are interested in CCIE security training with Tim. We do have a special for $19.95. It includes all your self-study materials, including the CCIE Security Technology Lab Workbook, which has a series of technology-based workbooks to help build the lab one technology at a time, and 10 CCIE Advanced Labs on our Advanced Lab Workbook, which have the full 8-hour simulations replete with these step-by-step walkthroughs and solution guides as well it's not noted there, but there's 25 sessions of rack time, 200 hours of rack time for you, as well as our video on demand series, a series of lectures that we did at the CCIE level. We saved the lecture portions and omitted the Q&A sessions because for those of you who already aren't signed up, go to www.securityie.com. It's a great way to interact with other security students and with your security instructors as well. Some upcoming events: the Advanced Lab Bootcamp and the Mock Lab Bootcamps are coming to Nevada September 12th to September 16th for Advanced Lab. The week after Mock Lab is 9/19 to 9/23. In both instances, students should be capable of working through a lab from end to end. In Advanced Lab Mentoring, it's much more active participation from the instructor in terms of going over technologies, just verifying techniques, everything from end to end on the 8-hour lab. In Mock Lab Bootcamp, it's a simulation. We're going to mimic the lab exam environment and give you an opportunity to gauge whether you are ready for the lab exam itself. For those of you who are still working on your security written exam, we do have a bootcamp scheduled for August 1st to August 5th. Still need about 3 more students. That's going to be in Seattle, Washington, and I believe Tim is the instructor for that bootcamp as well. If you have any further questions, feel free to email them to me. My email address is on the slide. It's jerry@ccbootcamp.com. For those of you who were only able to view or listen to a part of this demonstration, starting tomorrow, we will have access to the video for recording will be available for about 1 week. Feel free to email me, jerry@ccbootcamp.com, and I will get the link over to you as soon as it's available. Thanks so much, Tim.
All right, thanks a lot, Jerry. So let me pull up the Q&A here and see what other questions we might have. So the first question: is it necessary to understand the ASDM as well as the command line methods to configure this for the ASA test for CCNP security? So CCIE security, you don't have any access to ASDM in the lab, so it's totally command line. For CCNP security, I know that they do have some questions on ASDM, but I wouldn't expect to be required to know the ASDM version of that. I'll do a little bit of research on that for you there and get back to you, but I wouldn't expect to only be able to configure something with just ASDM. I think you'd have the option to do either or. It certainly is helpful to know where things are within ASDM, because typically if you find the section that's related to VPN within ASDM, you can pretty much find where the options are to click around and find it. But let me get back to you on the more specifics of that. There's a question regarding URL lists. Yeah, anything that's required to be configured through ASDM, you wouldn't be able to have access to that on the lab exam, so you won't be able to do that. So anything that's related to the URL list or portal customization, things like that you really can only configure through ASDM, you're not gonna have that as an option to you, so you can't configure it in the lab. Okay, so again, the real important things to remember for the lab exam is we want to make sure that not only is it working, but is it working per the task, and that's where a lot of people can lose points real easily because there's no partial credit. It's working, so we'll give them 3 points because it's working, but you're going to lose a couple points because you forgot this command, or it's not the case, unfortunately. So that's why when you're done with your lab, reboot everything, go back through the lab, reading it, make sure everything is okay, and then look for parts 1 and 2. There's a question about XML. Are you talking about like dynamic access profiles, or I'm not sure what related to XML. As far as editing and importing into the firewall, I wouldn't expect any of that on the I wouldn't expect any of that on the lab using any kind of XML editor or anything like that. Okay. Okay, well, any other? That was it for the questions. There any other questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody joining today. SSL VPN is a hot topic for the lab exam and also the real world. So I'd be pretty comfortable with it and familiar with it. So I appreciate you all joining, and let me know through email or any questions you might have. let us know, and we'll be happy to have a look at that. So thanks for joining, and have a good rest of your day.